determinations of how they impact, how the intended consequences happen, and how sometimes to prevent negative, unintended consequences. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you very much, Council Member. So before we move into our panel discussion, I just want to make a quick announcement of the first CLE code word, which is camera. So if you are watching this in part for CLE credit, the code word is camera, the first of two. So I will run through quick introductions of those who are speaking today. It's a really great group. Our moderator for the panel will be Penn Law Professor Anita Allen of Law and Philosophy. She's an expert on privacy law with a particular focus on the philosophy of privacy, bioethics, and the intersection of privacy and contemporary values. She's recognized for her trailblazing scholarship about legal philosophy, women's rights, and race relations. Lindsey Andersen works with tech companies to effectively incorporate business and human rights practices into their work and to engage in multi-stakeholder collaboration. She specializes in the intersection of technology, human rights, and international relations with an emphasis on the implications of artificial intelligence. Ali Breland is a journalist focused on technology, race, and politics. Currently at Mother Jones, covering internet disinformation, his writing on facial recognition technology has been cited by United States legislators and has appeared in Logic Magazine, The Guardian, The Hill, and other outlets. Adonne Washington is a legal fellow for the Digital Justice Initiative at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, with a particular focus on facial recognition technology. She has wide legal experience in matters of intellectual property, broadband content moderation, and platform competition issues. Last but not least, Devren Washington, a Philly local, focuses on building power in marginalized communities to bring equity and inclusion to people who need it most. With a focus on digital justice, he uses his experience as a founding member of the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund and organizer with Black Lives Matter Philadelphia to organize directly impacted communities around issues pertaining to technology, surveillance, and internet access. So with those introductions, I'll hand it over to Professor Allen.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me well. I'm so pleased to moderate this afternoon's panel, and I want to thank Councilman Curtis Jones for starting us off by grounding us in a stark reality. His personal story reminded me of something which is very present in my life that I often don't focus on, which is that I have a 6'4" African-American son who has been arrested, who has been shot, and who has spent time incarcerated at the age of only 24. So these are very, very real issues we're talking about today. We talk about how technology interfaces with criminal justice and other aspects of our lives. Happy Black History Month, everybody. So we have a month of learning about African-American history this year as well. So anyway, we're really in a very deeply digital age. Technology is radically changing the ways in which everybody lives. Some technologies have applications that we readily embrace and others do not. Some technologies have both safe and useful applications and also some dangerous ones. The example we'll be exploring today is facial recognition technology. And as you know, in some contexts, facial recognition technologies are great. I personally like them because they make it very easy for me, despite some nerve damage and arthritic fingers, to do everything from access my bank account to accessing Penn's daily COVID-19 symptom checker efficiently on my iPhone without having to manually enter a password or touch anything. But facial recognition poses threats to privacy and civil liberties, no doubt about that. The technology is not completely benign. Today's panel will explore how the technology is being used, its impact, and the road forward. we're not just recently discovering that facial recognition has frightening potential. I happen to be at the moment the chair of the board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, which is based in Washington, D.C. And 10 years ago, EPIC and about 100 other organizations put out a declaration, a statement called the Madrid Declaration that condemned the use of facial recognition and certain other biometric technologies and urged that there be a moratorium on them. That was 10 years ago. We're still now at the point where some cities and towns and nations are considering for the first time whether or not to ban or restrict the use of facial recognition technology. Should the road forward in the US include legislation like Senate Bill 1380 and House Bill 1538, which would establish a national moratorium on facial recognition technology and other remote biometric systems? Several Western cities have already done something similar to that. We have the Portland experience in San Francisco. We know for a fact that minority groups around the world, from the Uyghurs Muslim minority in China to the African American minority here in the US in our own backyard, these minority groups are disproportionately negatively impacted by mass surveillance schemes. Critics speak about the weaponization of technology, of power and privilege entrenched, of not just the panopticon, but the banopticon of targeted surveillance of marginalized groups. Today's panel will get to the heart of the civil rights and civil liberties issues raised by facial recognition and what solutions, consistent with anti-racism and freedom, we should pursue to better serve the public interest in justice and equity. So let's start our conversation with hearing from our four panelists about what makes facial recognition so problematic. I'd like to get the conversation going by giving Ms. Breland a chance to start us off. Ms. Breland?
Hi, yeah.
Oh, Mr. Breland, I'm sorry. Ollie.
It's okay. Yeah, the last name throws people off, and I understand. I'm very used to it. Yeah, so I mean, we've heard now for a few years, people have been sounding the alarm on this, activists and researchers, about the potential harms of facial recognition technologies. And I think that the sort of two main issues can be sorted into like two rough camps that like intersect with each other. And I think that people in both like believe very strongly. But basically, there's the societal issue of the total loss of privacy. Like if your face moves into a database and you can be tracked by your face, you essentially can enter a situation where like you have no privacy. We have an increasingly large amount of cameras. Cities like London and increasingly Houston have CCTV networks where they're implementing facial recognition technology. And if they really wanted to, they could track a person moving around their entire city. But even in cities where that's not the case, private technology and private companies like Amazon Ring are establishing their own little networks of cameras everywhere that can be integrated with facial recognition technology that certainly make it hard to move around as a private citizen in the public world and to have the belief that you're not being observed at any single time. And then the other issue is the sort of effect on marginalized groups of people in the United States. The sort of impact on Black communities that facial recognition can have is very concerning. The impact that it's already having. Black individuals have been the people that have been targeted so far by false cases of facial recognition, sort of like accusing them of being like cases or I guess like perpetrators of crimes. But also globally, like other marginalized groups can be targeted by this. There's already been massive controversy in China about Chinese government or researchers in China trying to use facial recognition technology to assess and assume who is a Uyghur Muslim. That's, if you're not familiar, the group that's being ethnically cleansed and detained in the country. So everywhere, this just presents massive issues.
Thank you very much. That's great. Allie, Lindsey, what would you add? Ms. Andersen, what would you add to what we just heard?
That was a really great overview, Ollie. So I'll try to, I guess, maybe just hone in on a couple points. So I think, like you said, there's sort of those two intersecting problems. And I think we sometimes, for obvious reasons, we focus, particularly in the US, very heavily on the racial bias issues, the fact that facial recognition systems at least right now, are almost universally less accurate on dark-skinned faces. And that's a huge problem because it, ultimately risks having discriminatory impacts, particularly when used in high-risk areas like law enforcement. But it is reasonable to expect that the accuracy issues will grow less and less prominent over time because these systems are improving all the time. There's both sort of an ethical imperative for companies to make their systems more accurate across the spectrum of people, and also business imperative. Customers don't want systems that don't work well. So I think it's also important to consider, looking beyond the bias issues, what, if at all, are we comfortable seeing facial recognition used in? And sort of thinking about the role that we want facial recognition to have in society, and what are the sort of reasonable bounds to put on it. And I'll leave it there. We can definitely get more into those details as we move along.
Thank you. Adonne Washington, in addition to the bias issues and the ethical issues that we've heard about so far, what would you say are some of the concerns that are raised by facial recognition?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the issue is, the problem is the use of it kind of generally, and it being integrated into a lot of areas, law enforcement, into education, into healthcare. A lot of it has begun to integrate itself, and we don't fully have an understanding of how it is being used, when it is even being used at times. And then oftentimes when there are issues with it, there is no kind of discussion or follow-up or evidence as to how it was used, or what the algorithms or the facial recognition technology may have been trained on. And so I think a big issue is that there is just not enough information being put out. And I think Ms. Andersen made a really good point about our comfortability level, because it is there and it's going to exist. And so trying to gain a better level of transparency as it is being implemented, depending on where it is being implemented. Right now, as you mentioned earlier, we are in the digital age. So, and as Mr. Breland said, there are cameras everywhere. And so right now it's difficult because we saw a lot of this with the false identification of the man in Detroit over the summer. And then you see there are protesters that have been tracked by a lot of this facial recognition technology. So then there's a fear that just kind of underlies all of it. And now you don't understand what's happening. You know that it's something that exists, and you hear these kind of conflicting stories. And so I think there's a large fear issue with what facial recognition has kind of landed at this point. I think moving forward, again, that kind of transparency is what is going to distinguish the more problematic uses of facial recognition technology not as problematic, comfortability level.
Thank you. We're doing great here at getting to the heart of this. The bias issues, the ethical corporate ethics issues and responsibility, and then the transparency concerns that were just raised. Devren Washington, have we left anything for you to say about this important issue of the problems raised by facial recognition technology?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so through my work here in Pennsylvania, I have real concerns compounding on everything that was just said with how it is used in Pennsylvania, right? So many people might have seen over the last summer, news reporting came out that DA Zappala in Allegheny County, specifically in Pittsburgh, basically built a network of cameras that all had facial recognition on them, and said that one of the uses of this would be to use against minors who are on probation, right? So there's some real concerns about how this technology would get used to further marginalize groups of people, be it those on probation, people who have been identified as being more likely to commit harm, and how that overlays with an already existing problem that we have of white supremacists being in our police department, and the police department itself being a tool of marginalization and oppression in our communities. Because really a large premise of this is that, you know, if we make policing better, if we make police better able, better equipped to do their jobs, then that will fix all of the problems that we have, right? And I think we spent a lot of time over the summer through the George Floyd and Walter Wallace protests, really grappling with the understanding that, you know, the time is now for us to be looking at something bold and new, other than policing, a different type of first responder. And so if we legitimize facial recognition and say this is something that can be controlled, it's something that we can make better and then introduce into the police department, it actually gets us further away from being able to imagine a first responder system that actually keeps our community safe.
Thank you, excellent. Maybe I'll give Councilman Curtis Jones a minute to respond. I mean, Councilman, you just heard these very, I think, perceptive remarks about local uses, how entrenched bias, racism, even white supremacy might affect local uses in the context where we're using a technology that's not transparent, where there's limited corporate ethics, and where we also have a problem with technologically unable to erase all the bias at this point. What do you think this means for Philadelphia?
Well, my grandmom said if 5 people are on a panel and all of them agree, 4 of them aren't necessary. So I'd like to offer a juxtaposition, not so much, I'm gonna say up front that we are not ready in the city of Philadelphia to allow facial recognition. So I'm gonna say that up front. And then I'm gonna say that we do need to take into account that a good friend of mine was one of the creators of the Real-Time Crime Center. I respect his ability because I know this gentleman was not a racist in his intent, but wanted to post 9/11, make sure that Philadelphia assets were protected by cameras, but then had the wisdom to know that neighborhoods needed protection as well. I will draw your attention to a 7-year-old boy named Zaire Jones. No personal relationship to me, but every relationship to me, was shot on his porch by individuals shooting up and down his block on Simpson Street. And he was playing with his toys and was struck in the head and killed. Those individuals were apprehended due to cameras that identified who they were. Not that the community came forward with names because they were afraid of retaliation. Not that the individuals wanted out of guilt to turn themselves in, but they knew their image had been captured on a camera and it was a matter of time. I would also point out the case several years ago where on a camera, a woman on Germantown Avenue or in Germantown was abducted, dragged into a cart and disappeared. We were able to find her abductor through the way the individual drug her away because he had a problem with his gait with one of his walks due to an injury. So as we start talking about privacy, I also want to balance that with the fact that in parts of my district, there's only been like 2 murders in 10 years. In other parts of my district, I represent 150,000 people, someone's going to be shot every 28 days. And it comes in bunches at times, and some of them are fatal. I chose to put my office in the heart of that at 59th and Market so that I would feel, my staff would feel that real life and death concern. My office manager, on Mondays, one of her rituals is to check the office for bullet holes. That's real. So I want you to understand that I am not for facial recognition because I believe that camera is neutral. It can do good things, it can do bad things. But in some people's hands, it'll be used for just what my colleagues on this panel have talked about. But in other people's hands, it'll be used to bring to justice some individuals that, yeah, we could talk about systemic causes of crime, that, you know, poverty is at a all-time. But for Zaire Jones, that's not enough.
Thank you. And since you decided that we should maybe spark some disagreement, I would point out that some minority activists believe that we should not ban facial recognition, but rather we should use it to watch the police. That a private citizen should be equipped with facial recognition technology to enable them to identify the particular police officers who may be engaged in otherwise concealed misconduct that is not able to be seen by the authorities. So that's another perspective as well. We can watch the watchers if we democratize the use of facial recognition potentially. So let's move now to solutions, to ways in which we think that maybe we can move forward. So what really are some of the ways that we think that industry can respond, the community can respond, the government can respond to the series of problems that we've been talking about, you know, from transparency to technological bias and to institutional entrenched bias and racism? What can we do? What can be done? And I'll just go back to the panel. We're about going in reverse order this time. How about if we start with Mr. Devren Washington? What do you think? How can we move forward, move ahead?
Sure. One of the things, one of the pieces of legislation that I've been supporting, which has also been enacted in Portland, I believe also in Oakland and some other townships, is the CCOPS legislation, which was drafted by the ACLU, CCOPS standing for Community Control of Police Surveillance. And what this requires is for our council members, and I have brought it in front of Councilman Jones and some other members of City Council, is for them to use the power at their control, which is the purse strings of the city, to say, if you want to purchase any type of surveillance technology, that has to be brought in front of City Council. We have to deliberate on it and then give you your approval. And so what that would do is, one, require for all of the city, all of the departments in the city, to say what surveillance technology they have, right? For those technologies to be reviewed, the uses to be reviewed and approved. And then if they were want to get more, they have to get approved by City Council. That does a number of things. So for the community, it gives us, it shines some sunlight on what technology is in existence and how it's used. And then it gives us a way to advocate for ourselves to determine what is appropriate and what isn't. And so that is one piece of legislation. And there are others that kind of speak to the issue of where we are, where there is no current federal law or mandate that gives us our privacy in this area. Yeah.
Thank you. And you made me wonder whether such legislation should be technology specific or whether it should be broad enough to cover a range of technologies, say drones, private use of drones, for example, or public uses of drones, as well as facial recognition, as well as gait recognition. Do we have, would we just address one at a time, or do we have some kind of comprehensive scheme? Adonne Washington, what do you think about solutions?
Yeah, so I think part of the solutions, the Digital Justice Initiative at the Lawyers Committee, last summer, we talked with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board when they asked for comments regarding putting facial recognition technology into airports. And we saw that as normalizing the use of facial recognition. You know, if you put it in airports, then, you know, other agencies and other organizations will want to incorporate this, and it will become something that's just normalized. And so moving forward, in the event that, you know, facial recognition technology, there is no moratorium and it becomes something that is used regularly, clear and comprehensive definitions of permissible and impermissible uses are going to be essential for it to be effective and in line with the transparency of it, because you're going to have to create a public trust in the facial recognition technology, and allow for the candid evaluation from individuals. So even if the watch don't become the watchers, we still need to be able to have the discussions and analyze and evaluate, here's how we feel about it, here's what we think, and being very vocal about what facial recognition technology means to marginalized communities and just to general individuals. We also need to have the ability to hold entities that employ the facial recognition technology accountable. So in the event that the police department or an employer decides to use the facial recognition technology in everything that they're doing, we need to be able to speak up and say, hey, there's an issue with this. Here's why, here's what the experience is. And we need to be able to hold them accountable and have them come back and tell us, here's how we trained it, here's what the issue is. In the event that, there is an actual identifiable issue, which as we know, facial recognition technology tends to have a disparate impact no matter what, we need to be able to address that and go back and edit that or take it away, take it off the table, whatever needs to be done so that it's not just continuing use in these different areas. The last thing I think that's important is understanding the potential harms and the potential risks as we move into this kind of more vocal and open society, kind of with social media being able to expose a lot of different things and people being able to spread news more widely. Understanding the risks and the harms that are associated with it, the issues, the civil rights implications that exist, the race and gender bias, profiling of activists, and then potential chilling effects on speech and assembly in general, everyone needs to be on the same page and understanding that those risks and effects exist. And I think, organizations and entities employ facial recognition for the ease that they think it might bring or potentially the helpfulness that exists. And oftentimes they're not seeing, what that impact could be later on down the line for other individuals in marginalized communities.
Thank you. So you pointed to some of the ways in which the use of the technology or the advocacy of it might be short-sighted, and of the problems of normalization. First you start in airports, then you're going to kind of bleed into the rest of society. I've already been involved in a experimental program in the Atlanta airport to admit passengers on the plane based not on their boarding pass, but on facial recognition. It was very interesting. I don't know what happened to that little initiative, but it's already out there. What about it, Ms. Andersen? What do you think we can do to maybe make some progress towards solving the problems that you and others have raised on this panel?
Yeah, so I think one really important first step is coming to some level of agreement about the boundaries of use of facial recognition, particularly by law enforcement and in sort of the public surveillance context. There's lots of sort of ethical frameworks you could use to come to this conclusion, but as an international human rights person, I obviously favor that framework, and I'm going to mention it since we have so many current and future lawyers on the call here. So one thing that international human rights always makes clear is that anytime you are going to limit someone's rights, there are various justifiable reasons you might do so, public safety being one, then that limitation needs to be lawful, necessary, proportionate, and non-discriminatory. And so if you sort of go down that list of requirements and you think through some of the applications of facial recognition by law enforcement that we've seen, there are some pretty clear lines that you can draw. So for example, it's pretty clear that it would not be necessary nor proportionate for law enforcement to use facial recognition to identify every single person at a protest that's peaceful, right? That is a huge disproportionate restriction on the privacy rights of a massive amount of people. But it might be necessary and proportionate to use facial recognition to identify a subject in the camera footage from a specific CCTV camera you've gotten the footage, through lawful judicial order as part of a legitimate criminal investigation, and you've seen that person breaking the law, and you want to use facial recognition to try to identify them. And that's actually one of the most common uses of it by law enforcement right now. The big kicker, of course, here is the non-discrimination factor. And as long as we have differential error rates for different races, there's a real risk of discrimination in facial recognition, period, which can be somewhat mitigated by the way that law enforcement uses that information in the role of human review. But given there's no sort of regulation or requirements for law enforcement, and we know obviously that systemic racism is real, it's really hard to know if that can be adequately mitigated right now. So that's sort of the first thing, is drawing the lines. And then I think to sort of focus on the role of companies for a second, since that's really been my area of focus in the past few years. So first off, law enforcement customers are always considered high risk for any company. And that's just because of the powers that they have. They can arrest you, they can take away their rights. The decisions they make using technology are super high impact. And so we generally expect companies to treat law enforcement customers with particular care. The standards of ensuring that your technology can be used ethically should be really high. So we would say that if there is a significant risk that your technology will be used by a law enforcement customer in a way that's likely to infringe on people's rights, and you as the company don't think you can adequately prevent that from happening, then you should not sell that technology. So, I think the decisions that lots of the big tech companies have come out with, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, where they've said, we're not going to sell our facial recognition systems to law enforcement right now, I think those are good, because as others have mentioned, there's no regulation, there's no transparency requirement, there's no way that companies can verify their technology won't be misused. Now, of course, that might change down the road if there eventually is regulation, if there are strict use requirements for law enforcement. And then in that case, we would tell the company that it is their duty to examine those sort of misuse prevention policies and make sure that appropriate safeguards are in place. And we would tell them that they really need to do good, extensive training of the law enforcement customers to make sure that they understand the technology, the impact of the decisions they make on technical things like where you set your match threshold, for example, and things like that. But the problem right now is that most of the law enforcement facial recognition vendors aren't those big tech companies who've said they won't sell to them. They're either smaller startup firms or they're companies that are headquartered in other countries. And globally, lots of companies look at the US, they see a government customer, they think, well, it's a democracy, rule of law based, like they're low risk for us compared to, say, China or Russia or some other authoritarian country. And they're not, they're not looking at the reality of policing in the US. And so that's why they're continuing to sell. So I guess in conclusion, yes, there really is a role for tech companies in pushing for change, but as long as there are other vendors who are willing to sell to law enforcement without any kind of safeguards, there's only going to be so much that companies who care about this can do, and that's really where government regulation comes into play.
Thank you so much for reminding us that it's not just the big four players in this realm. It's also a lot of smaller companies that can engage in this business and actively market it, but most people wouldn't even be aware of it or be focusing on that. And so it just kind of continues. I hope during Q&A we have a chance to ask you, like, point blank, whether you think that the events of January the 6th or going back in time, the Boston Marathon bombings are situations that meet your criteria of proportionality, necessity, and lawfulness for using the technology. We're going to move on right now to Mr. Ali Breland for his comments on his last set of comments on this particular question about what can we do moving ahead. Mr. Breland?
Yeah, thank you. I think that everyone's answers so far have obviously been really good. There definitely does need to be, I guess, like a stricter set of rules and like sort of safeguards in place. Broadly though, like beyond the sort of specifics, I don't have a lot to add to that other than that I am just generally pessimistic of the future of these kinds of things, even with sort of laws in place. As a journalist, like so much of my work, not even just in this field, is just like observing people breaking rules all the time and then sort of trying to like rectify everything ex post facto or asking for forgiveness. And even if they don't get it, the transgressions still occur. And that's something that's definitely happening to some degree with facial recognition technology, but it's just a general tendency of like institutions of power. Like if this exists, even with guardrails, police, law enforcement agencies, the national security state will abuse it, and then sort of like hopefully journalists or watchdogs or whistleblowers will help uncover these things after the fact. But just the fact that like that sort of catch-up work has to be played is concerning. And so I do, if I really have to think about it, I think that like at the very least, like some kind of like further moratorium is preferable until like some sort of strict guidelines can be placed down and until there can be a sort of like where it's possible or reimagining of these sorts of institutions that are using them. I think that the way certain institutions have been operating for so long all but guarantees that even with rules there will be abuse, and that will just be like another thing for these people, like not journalists like myself but also watchdogs and everyone else who tries to produce accountability. We'll just have like another thing on our plates to try to handle. And the reality is that law enforcement agencies, groups like the CIA, NSA, FBI, are much more well-resourced than a lot of us. They have more time to do this. It's almost like a losing battle to get into. And I don't know where I stand on an outright ban, but like for a lot of reason, I've heard compelling arguments for outright bans on these kinds of things, period. Just because that's the only way to like sort of protect against this inevitable encroachment that will happen no matter what rules you put up.
Thank you very much, panel. We have a couple of really interesting questions to explore, and I'd love to get your thoughts about the questions raised by the audience. One question is about the public using techniques of resistance to try to thwart the efficacy of facial recognition technology, whether that might mean wearing a mask or wearing big sunglasses or wearing makeup that distorts the facial features. Are there any arguments in light of what we talked about today for the public seeking ways to not be cooperative? I do know that back in the early days of gait and facial recognition, there were engineers, including engineers on Penn's faculty, who were working with counter technologies that would be able to thwart some of the technologies that were being developed to recognize. But how do we feel about citizen efforts to resist the efficacy of facial recognition technology? Is the councilman still here? Mr. Yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts about this, because I know, I mean, you point out there's good and bad to camera technology, but what about if there was a mass movement to thwart the technology's efficacy? Would it be appropriate, say, to ban the wearing of masks or ban the wearing of maybe even Muslim modesty clothing, because it might just conceal the face in a way to make it harder for the technology to work? Do we have a right to sort of resist?
As a commissioner on the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, I would be against anybody trying to stop anyone from wearing whatever they wanted, whether it was big sunglasses or definitely hijabs that Muslims wear. I would be against that. There is a fine line of what government has a responsibility to do to keep us safe versus intruding in our privacy. And walking that line is very difficult, but it is incumbent upon all of us to say and cry foul when they do. So I would be against prohibiting people from putting whatever they want on their face. We already wear masks due to COVID. I mean, you know, we promote that and then ban it in another breath. That would be hypocritical.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. And the way you framed it takes us to our second question very naturally, which is about the whole issue of government control writ large in this age of facial recognition, gait recognition, and other surveillance technologies. Is there a reason for us to be globally concerned about a move toward a more autocratic form of government, a less democratic form of government? And the person who raised this question asked us to think Egypt, in which the government often uses internet blockages and other technologies as a means of stemming unrest and controlling communication among the population. And I'll just throw this question out to anyone on the panel who'd like to address these concerns.
I could jump in quickly and just say, yes, we should be concerned about our government trying to control the movements and know the movements of private citizens. And I think that sometimes we in America live in an illusion that we have more control over our government than what is possible, you know. And so I would say we need to spend a lot more time looking at how we are in active contradiction with the idea of democracy that we have and how that is implemented. And for an example, I would say the first judicial district here in Philadelphia, right? In Philadelphia, it is easier for us to indict and jail a sitting judge than it is for us to oust them through the retention vote, right? And what does that mean for individual judges that are acting out of will with the public, right? And then think about how these technologies can also exacerbate those inconsistencies with democracy, and how close we are to almost losing major control of our elected officials, some of our elected officials, and how they administer government. So that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about all the time, and I could go on forever and ever, but I'll stop here.
Would anyone else like to comment on the question of the shift from a more democratic to a more autocratic form of government as a general concern?
Well,
Go ahead.
no, I yield.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would just say that, you know, this has been a trend for probably about the last 10 years. If you look at, for example, Freedom House, Global Freedom of the World reports, there's been a decline consistently, both in democratic states and in those sort of pseudo-democratic, leaning toward autocratic states over the last 10 years. And that is really augmented by increasing use of technology by just everyday people, and also increasing availability of surveillance technology by governments. It used to be that you needed to build this stuff yourself, so you needed to have a lot of resources and a lot of know-how. And so it was really sort of limited to the big players. But now it's commercially available all around the world, and relatively affordable. So yeah, I think absolutely it's a super scary context globally, and one that's honestly only going to be more and more relevant, particularly when you consider that there's a huge lack of data protection laws worldwide, and a huge increase in laws that enable really invasive government surveillance. So
thank you. Let me add to the set of questions another question that's come up in the audience, which is about, and you kind of hinted at this, or you pointed at this problem, Ms. Andersen, private uses of surveillance technology. So, you know, we have businesses, industry wanting to use facial recognition, other surveillance technologies for their purposes, the government, but also individual people want to use it. I mean, people want to have their whole home, their property surrounded by cameras that surveil the neighborhood, and, you know, and watch the neighborhood, watch the neighbors, watch intruders potentially. But do you think there's a problem with the public coming to use this technology for their own purposes, whether or not they are acting in concert with business and industry and government? What about just these purely sort of personal uses of it? Is there a private sphere that ironically allows us to kind of keep track of other people and maybe compromise their privacy?
is this a question for me?
You can give it a go. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, you did kind of, like I said,
Yeah.
you kind of got to it. Yeah.
This, I would be really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about this too, but I think this is a particularly tricky area because the bounds on sort of individual behavior are much harder to draw. And I guess to take one example, we have individual people using facial recognition to identify folks who were participating in the Capitol insurrection, and doing so, like helping law enforcement, like identifying people and sending that information to the FBI, which, you know, maybe sounds great. We hope those people are arrested, but at the same time, if you extrapolate that same scenario to like another context, it could be identifying people who are at like a pride parade or like a I don't know, a trans rights protest or something where you have like a group that is highly vulnerable, often subject to violence, you know, being identified, being outed by private citizens trying to, you know, cause harm. And so that's one area where I don't have super clear thoughts about the best way to sort of regulate things and prevent things from happening. But I think it's concerning and something that like we're going to need. We focus so much on government use for obvious reasons, but we need to start thinking more about private use as well.
Adonne, I'd love to ask you, you know, it's often said that one of the reasons why we shouldn't be trying to cut back on facial recognition is that there's no such thing as the right to privacy in a public place. If you're walking in the streets, going into a business, at a sports stadium, you have no right to not be surveilled. What response can we give that's sensitive to civil rights and civil liberties, that to this idea that there's no such thing as the right to privacy in public? It's almost an oxymoron, some would say.
Yeah, I think that's important to discuss when thinking about facial recognition technology. Kind of the first thing that individuals go to is, well, my right to privacy. And as you said, there isn't really a right to privacy, you know, in those public spaces. My mind immediately goes to the Supreme Court's ruling in Carpenter more recently, and kind of how, yes, while there is no, you know, universal right to privacy, especially in these public spaces, the conversation around what rights we have in terms of how searches are being conducted, how this information is being used, are becoming a lot more prevalent. And so I think looking at Carpenter, the court was very, the court was kind of very specific and drew that decision very narrowly because of the facts in that case. And I think as we move forward, putting more cases like the use of surveillance, so in United States v. Jones, putting more uses like that to the courts and to bring in these cases to get a better definition of where these, you know, since there is no official overarching privacy law, kind of where are these distinctions? Where do we have the rights? When can I say, you know, this is too far? Looking at California and their more recent regulation in terms of websites having, I'm sorry, not websites, individuals having the ability to contact websites and say, hey, how are you using my data? And it's required that those websites respond and let them know. And people have the ability to then, you know, erase it. So moving forward, kind of to that point, I guess, is just focusing on how do we change it and how do we, you know, how do we kind of get that definition drawn or get some understanding on what this is going to look like for individuals if we're not going to have an overall privacy law that kind of just encompasses people even in public. But, you know, like when your phone, what you're doing on your phone, even if it is in a public space, that is still your private information. But there are still kind of, the jury is still out in certain cases on the extent to which that can be accessed or used by the government.
Yeah, so I mean, we do have pretty clear precedent that the Fourth Amendment can be cited to protect privacy of communications that may take place in quote unquote public places as opposed to in the privacy of our homes or other domestic spaces. But there's still this sort of, I think, nagging problem that we don't have a clear definition of what privacy means outside of the traditional sphere of home and family. Ali, Breland, what is your thought about how we even define privacy or characterize privacy for the purpose of facial recognition and other technologies capture people's faces when they're in the public realm?
Yeah, from my conversations with like activists and privacy experts who spend a lot of time thinking about this, they have really honed in definitions that I think are very thoughtful, but like, it's useful, I guess, to kind of think of like, you know, spaces that have traditionally been spaces that are private, that we like assume privacy that we were comfortable in, as sort of like areas of privacy. So like being able to walk around in public without people, for the most part, recognizing you, unless like, you know, someone who actually knows you or is looking for you sees you, I guess is like a good precedent and a good way to move forward. And there's no reason to sort of decide that like we should relitigate these kinds of spaces where you're out in the open, like, or things like that. I think also a really good way of thinking about these kinds of things and biometric technologies like facial recognition, but biometric technologies generally is the sort of reversibility of it. Other sorts of information that's like collected on you that can be used to identify you often can be changed. It's like not necessarily immutable, but things like your face, your DNA, your fingerprints, things like that are sort of very scary lines of privacy to breach, because if they're hacked, there's nothing you can do to ever change that. There's nothing you can do to stop people from like getting your genetic sequence or from getting your face and like using that for other things potentially. So I think that like reversibility and sort of traditional norms of privacy are good lines to put down.
Thank you so much. And we're gonna put those thoughts together here and sum up this wonderful panel, which I found to be an unusually clear exposition of the problems of facial recognition, as well as some of the solutions that are available to us. I think in conclusion, I just like to urge that we do remember that privacy is an aspect of freedom, extremely important aspect of freedom. Sometimes the general public seems indifferent to their privacy, yet everybody has an interest in making sure that we don't sort of slip into an autocratic society in which people no longer have the ability to enjoy anonymity in public, privacy in the private sphere. So thank you very much, all the panelists, Mr. Breland, Ms. Andersen, Ms. Washington, and Mr. Washington, and Councilman Jones for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our student planners who put this event together. If you are attending for CLE and you missed the second code word is computer. If you please make sure that you input that on your event evaluation. I will drop in the chat one more time the event evaluation for CLE. It is a mandatory aspect to receive your CLE credits with us today. And you also should have received an email that had your written materials attached to it as well. So I just wanted to say on behalf of the Toll Public Interest Center, thank you to all who joined us for this wonderful panel discussion to kick off our 13th annual Public Interest Week. We really enjoyed having you here, and thank you again to our panelists and to our student planners who put this together.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a second reminder, this event was organized by the Penn ITS Collective. We are a newly forming student group for Internet, Society, and Technology discussions. Our purpose is going to be to facilitate critical analysis and discussions of newly emerging digital technologies and their interactions and relationship with the law. So if you are a Penn student or affiliate, you're interested in joining our listserv to learn more about what we're doing, I just put that link in the chat as well. So thank you again to our panelists. This was great.